I have been trying to read more literary fiction because I have read surprisingly little of it. And by literary fiction, I mean the type of book you might hear recommended on NPR. It's kind of a nebulous thing, and there's a bunch of different stuff I've kind of categorized under this, but go with me. Let's talk about some highbrow literature. I finally reread The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This has been one of my favorite books for a very long time, and I think I finally cracked the code on when I can incorporate audiobooks into my reading routine. This is a physical copy of the book I have, but I read most of this via audiobook. And I actually really liked listening to this as a reread on audiobook. It took a story I was familiar with, slowed it down, because I can read much faster than I can listen. So it made me notice things that I did not notice in the first pass, and to hear it differently, which I really kind of liked. So I think I'm going to do that moving forward, rereads as audiobooks that I listen to as I fall asleep or when I'm cleaning. Maybe on the train, not sure about that, maybe just when I'm walking. But back to The Remains of the Day. I first read this over 5 years ago and was enthralled with the juxtaposition of the proper guide to butling and the geopolitical machinations occurring on the fringes. Rereading it now, I am struck more forcefully with the character study of a man who's been shaped by paternal and social expectations into one form of a man, only to find that society's shifting expectations have left him somewhat behind. If possible, I am more in love with this book than when I first read it. It easily remains a 5-star book. Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. This was a book club book for me. It's a very Dickensian style book where Sue, who has grown up in the care of Mrs. Suxby, a baby farmer, agrees to be an accomplice in a plot where she would become the maid to a rich young lady and convince her to marry a conman known as Gentleman. Twists and turns ensue. This was a difficult book for me. The first fourth of the book spends a lot of time impressing upon you how boring and restrictive life was in the mansion. It just kind of drags. But then it actually picks up and is more interesting throughout, but you gotta get through that first quarter. So I ended up not really disliking it, but it's hard for me to recommend as you have to slog for a while to even get anywhere. So A Separate Piece by John Knowles is a book I read in early high school and really loved. This was back when I was discovering that books could be nuanced, that they didn't all have to be black and white with a clear moral at the end. In this one, our protagonist is clearly morally muddy and conflicted and a little bit good and a little bit evil. Set in World War II among a group of boys at boarding school who are just too young to be drafted and are thus almost cocooned in the last innocence before war would intrude. It's a coming-of-age tale where the war never actually becomes a main character, but exists as almost this allegory for lost innocence. A loss of innocence that ends up intruding into their lives even when the war does not. It's pretty powerful. I can't say I connected as deeply with it as I did as a teen, but I still certainly appreciated it. Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Haruki Murakami. This is the second Murakami book I've read. I read 1Q84 at the end of last year, which was like 1,000 pages. It was a beast. And I gotta say, picking up this book, it felt like 1Q84 had never really ended. Just the sex of the main character changed from female to male. Otherwise, the characters felt starkly the same. I did like this one better than 1Q84 though. I thought that the science fiction aspects of the plot were actually quite interesting and provided a good framework to the story. A framework that frankly did not need the random magical realism moments that he threw in. Those moments never really paid off. It just felt like he put them there because that's what he is. He's the magical realism guy. All in all, guys, I just don't think Murakami is for me. I reread The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. The first time I read this was over 5 years ago, so I thought it was time for a reread because I always recommend it, but kind of forgot the finer points of the plot. I mean, I remember that it was from the perspective of a boy on the autism spectrum who's trying to solve the murder mystery of a dog. But beyond that, I didn't really remember anything, which makes recommending it kind of awkward. So I went back to reread. On the reread, I still really liked it. Maybe a tad bit less than the first time around, but it's still just a really strong story through a different lens than we're used to looking. If you haven't read this one, it's very short and very unique. I recommend picking it up. What books have you read that take a different perspective than we're used to seeing in books? And what literary fiction books would you recommend I read?